Okay, so let's look at some of the differences between acrylic paint and watercolor paint. These are the acrylic paints down here at the bottom. These are the watercolor paints over here on the side. The first thing to note is that the brushes for each one are unique to that kind of paint. So a watercolor brush you're going to find is very soft, very flexible, whereas an acrylic or an oil painting brush is going to be much thinner, and it's going to be more like a spoon-shaped or flat like this. Now, in terms of how they're used, watercolor paint is meant to absorb water. That's why it's so soft. The bristles on it are designed to hold a great deal of water because you need to use water to use the paint. The acrylic paints tend to not hold as much water. In fact, you don't really want to use much water when you're painting with acrylic. Now, watercolor paints are water soluble. As soon as you start to add water to them, they start to dissolve. So even if the paint seems dried out, it's still usable. Now, quality watercolor paint will flow very nicely. The more expensive the paint, the more likely it is to have much finer ground pigments and less filler. Now, watercolor paints are designed to be used with a lot of water, and they're designed to kind of blend with water. And there's a lot of different techniques which we'll get into later, but you can see that the paint dissolves with the application of water, and that when you mix the paints together, again, nice quality paints, they'll flow nicely, they'll blend nicely. So you can see you can blend the blue and the yellow and get some nice greens. You can bring in some of the reds into it and get some nice oranges, some violets. You'll notice that watercolor paints tend to be very transparent. As you apply them over on top of another color, that color will show through. Now, acrylic paints, on the other hand, are much more opaque. They're not designed to be used with water. In fact, you never want to have more than 30% water mixed in with the paint. Any more than that, and the paint will start to degrade, and it won't stick correctly to the surface that you're painting on. Just like with the watercolor, a higher quality acrylic paint will have more pigment, and it will have a finer ground pigment, so the colors will be more vibrant. That's really the only difference in price. You're kind of paying for the amount of pigment that's in it. And acrylic paints apply much more opaque, they cover more directly, and we'll get more into the techniques of using those. If you want to blend, kind of have to do with acrylic paint, you have to do it when the paint is wet. So once the acrylic paint dries, it becomes waterproof and you cannot reactivate it. So blending two pigments together, you need to do that before the paint dries. With watercolor, once the paint dries, you can paint on top of it, and because it's transparent, the two colors will give the appearance of mixing together. So again, that's just kind of a really brief introduction into the differences between watercolor and acrylic. We'll be going over each one with much more detail as the semester progresses.